The Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ presents a survey of the Book of Numbers, tracing Israel's journey from the second year after Egypt toward the threshold of the Promised Land. It frames Numbers as a narrative of covenant, worship, leadership, and recurrent failure, showing how liturgical law, priestly duties, and communal discipline shape Israel's identity while revealing moral and spiritual lapses that delay the fulfillment of God's promises. Each lesson combines historical context, close reading, and practical reflection. The curriculum covers the establishment of the Jewish religion and political structures as God outlined it. The class material can be downloaded from the Cornelius Church of Christ website or using the QR code in this introduction.
That was real profitable. I got to do some stuff in California, preach in California as well, and so there was a lot of good things to do there. It's always encouraging when you have those opportunities, and I'm grateful all the men that filled in for me while I was away, so we could do that very thing. We're in Numbers chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10 tonight. I hope you had a chance to read it ahead of time. We'll go through it though. I mean, one of the purposes of this class is to survey it, to move kind of quickly through a lot of different things. These first few chapters are a lot of, you might feel like repetitious, or a lot of, a lot of numbering of things, hence the name of the book, Numbers. Bad news, tonight is the last nice chapter, because after chapter 10, all it seems like is it's all the ways that Israel's going to blow their relationship with God. It's kind of like a movie where the first part of the movie is really fun and everybody's happy, and then the bad part starts afterwards. And unfortunately, that's where the book of Numbers is going to take us. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Would you join me in prayer? Most holy God and Father in heaven, we're so very grateful that in the middle of our week and the world surrounding us, we have a few minutes of time to be together. To look at each other, to encourage each other, and to remind each other of why it is that your word is important and why we live for you and all the good things that come from this. Father, we have a lot of people that are really going through some difficult times right now, and we pray that you would be with them, that you'd be with the Royland and Jones family, you'd be with the Hanson family, be with all those who are traveling, all those who are sick. We have just a lot of people that we care about, that you care about, and as they're hurting, we're hurting. And Father, we know that you are with us, for you are the God that sympathizes with us utterly. So Father, we pray you'll be with them, bring comfort, bring healing. Let the best of things occur, Father, that can come out of difficult situations. We love you and we thank you for this time. And in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So the reason that why I love the book of Numbers, I know that Lamar covered a lot of this, is that one of the things about the book of Numbers is that it really is important to the New Testament. It really is important. In fact, again, your key passage that I know we're going to cover a lot of times is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where the Apostle Paul basically tells most of the book of Numbers and reminds the church in Corinth, hey, this is your story. And so it's important for us to remember that when we're going through the book of Numbers, this is kind of our story. The Israelites are sometimes called the congregation of Israel. And you might think of the idea that they're a congregation of people that are in a relationship with God, and there's expectations and things they need to be doing, and they're going to blow it. I've already given away the, what do we call it, a spoiler? We've already given away what's going to happen, but you knew that probably. They're going to blow that relationship. And Paul tells the Corinthians that this was written for you to understand how dangerous the things that they fell for are things that we fall for. And there's a lot to the book of Numbers that fall into this language of these things. But there's also a lot of little things in the book of Numbers. Like, for example, when we talk about the bronze serpent, we'll just touch that real briefly, one chapter. And yet Jesus says in John chapter 3, hey, you remember the bronze serpent? That's me. And he'll explain something really neat about that. Talked already about things like the Nazirite vow. We'll talk about things like the city of refuge. And those are things that are really critical for us to kind of be thinking about. So for a lot of us, too, we didn't have that opportunity. Some of us who grew up going to church as children, we would have heard a lot of these things in the classes. It kind of is our practice of teaching the Old Testament more in younger classes. I think it's kind of a mistake. because a lot of us don't then get the grounding in the New Testament we need to know, because we're supposed to know what happened to the Israelites. So we're in Numbers chapter 7 tonight, and this point starts off, and we'll just go ahead and read the first verse to set us up. It says, "It came to pass when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle that he anointed it and consecrated it and all its furnishings and the altar and all the utensils. So he anointed them and consecrated them." We're told in a couple of places about this instituting of the worship in the tabernacle, And so you find this in the book of Exodus, chapter 40. You find it again in the book of Numbers. And basically what happens is it takes them about a year in the wilderness to put together the tabernacle. What do you remember about the tabernacle? I guess I'm going to ask the very first question. First question I'd ask is, what does the word tabernacle mean? Tabernacle. What does the very word mean, Teresa? It just means tent. Yeah, it just means a tent. And what we're talking about is a tent that had walls that were made out of, tent materials, whether it was leather and cloth. Then we had an inner tent, and that inner tent was 2 rooms. What were the 2 rooms? Holy place and the Holy of Holies. Very good. These two places. Now, so we had these 2 places like this. Now, we had utensils that are mentioned here, things that were very particular to it. And these are things, by the way, that the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 8 will say, hey, you need to know about these things because they are foreshadows of things that we talk about. So, for example, there's a conversation about an altar. What is an altar? What is an altar? Teresa?
Something you sacrifice.
Yeah, a place where you offer a sacrifice. We still even use the term today sometimes. We really probably don't as much as denominations do, but they talk about an altar call.
What's that, an altar?
This is a lectern, yeah. You know what?
In some churches they call it an altar.
I sometimes I'll hear people call this like the altar call, as I was going to say, and that's probably what you're thinking of, where we talk about an altar call. And so sometimes you hear people talk about like the table where it's set up as an altar. Truly, though, an altar was a place where a sacrifice was offered. A sacrifice was offered. Some of the famous altars of the Bible, of course, there was this great, enormous altar that the Israelites built. You go back to Exodus 40, you can read about how it was put together. There were stone altars that God ordered to be built several times. There's the altar that Elijah ordered to be built. There were the false altars. Places where, like in the northern tribes, where they had these false worship there. And one of the things, by the way, about an altar was God had said, especially during the period of the kingdoms and the judges, that the Israelites were meant to only go to certain altars to make their sacrifices. In other words, they didn't just go anywhere, but they only went to certain places to make those offerings. And a lot of times, one of the things they would do is they would go to places called high places. You'll hear about those later in the Bible. And they would make sacrifices of things, and that was very offensive to God. God said, I really want you to commit to offering specifically altars, sacrifices on altars that I have permitted. We read about utensils. You think utensils, you think knife, fork, and spoon. But utensil means a utilized instrument. What were some of the other instruments that were inside the tabernacle? Can you remember any others?
Candlestick.
Candlesticks. There's a great big candlestick, yeah, that illuminated. It sat on, if I remember this right, you would walk in, and I want to say it was on your left side. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say it, but I was thinking it was on one side, and it illuminated something on the other side. What was on the other side? Anybody remember? Showbread, yeah. There was a little table over there, and Grant, put it on the spot. How many loaves of showbread? Maybe this is an easy guess. 12 loaves of showbread that every day the priests were required to put out and sprinkle incense on. And then at the end of the day, they would dispose of those. You might remember the story of David coming and needing something to eat, and they gave him something to eat from that table. But that table was only the priests were allowed to eat that bread, and they would lay it out every day, 12 loaves. And the table was called the Table of the Presence of God. I always think it's kind of neat because it's an unusual name. And the idea is that bread was kind of like God's pleasure with Israel. And of course, Jesus later says, I'm the bread of life.
It wasn't unleavened, was it?
I don't think it was. That's a great question, Stephen. Stephen, that's a really good question. I don't believe it was. And I'll say the reason I don't believe it was is that in the Old Testament, the only use of unleavened bread was for the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And anybody remember why they had unleavened bread in the Old Testament for that? What was it meant to symbolize? Yeah, haste. Yeah. Now for us, it's different. We use unleavened bread to symbolize the lack of sin. Well, I say we do. That's what's prescribed to us. But we talk about the idea that Jesus was without sin, so the bread is unleavened because leaven is like sin. But for them, it was about the Passover leaving in haste. And so the idea was it doesn't necessarily. So that's a really neat question. And no, like I said, to my recollection, the bread was just regular bread. One more thing in there that was kind of important.
I was wondering, is there some utensil that the fire was put into? Because you know the
Yeah, there was. And that actually is the last utensil. What was it? You think about what was it?
I said a bowl.
I don't remember. It was like that kind of big a pole. But what were they burning in it? Incense, yeah. So incense. The Hebrew writer says the incense today is our prayers. There's kind of a neat idea. So all these things are kind of neat things that we think about. The candelabra that illuminates. You can think, well, like the Word of God illuminates things, and the table, the bread of life. Like I said, there's a lot of neat symbolism. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying, I've been reading Revelation recently, and there it talks about the altar with the prayers of the saints on it.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the places where it talks about rising up like incense, right?
It says that it's in a bowl, and like the angel takes it and throws it back
Oh,
down to where.
neat. I didn't remember it being the prayer being in a bowl, but that's a neat point. One more super important instrument, but it's not in this room. It's in the next room behind the wall, behind the curtain. The Ark of the Covenant. Yeah, Ark of the Covenant. And so that's going to be something super important as well. So just to kind of gives you a good sense of all this, that in chapter 7, what is going on here is the Israelites, these things have been consecrated. The word consecrate is important. Consecrate means to be made holy. Be made holy. Until it's consecrated, it's just a thing that they're working on. It's just something that they're building. But once it's consecrated, what does it become? Becomes something special. So I think of it like this. I think of the idea that before the tabernacle's consecrated, all these craftsmen are coming in and out, they're sawing things, and they're eating their sandwiches, and they're going through the stuff, and they're taking a nap and things like that. But once it becomes consecrated, who's going in there? Only the priests. Yeah. This idea of consecrated, sometimes the word is dedicated, but consecrated means to be set apart, to be holy. Once it is consecrated, it becomes something special. This is why you mentioned the fire that comes out. Who are you talking about?
You're talking about who took it?
Yeah, or who with the guys who got in trouble? Nadab and Abihu, just a few months after this. Interestingly enough, not going to be recorded in this book, because the Nadab and Abihu's record in Leviticus is to remind priests how you're supposed to go this, but they're going to early on go in there, and they're going to be struck down dead because they're not going to offer the authorized fire that God had said to offer. So now the Israelites are coming forward, and they're bringing in all these different items. The leaders in chapter 7 are bringing out, first of all, they bring covered carts and oxen, and Moses divides this up to the Israelites, or to the Levites. He says, okay, the Israelites are now all donating oxen and carts for moving these things, and so he divides it up among the Levites, and I'll have a question about one group that doesn't receive anything in verse 9, but he divides it all up, and then the leaders begin bringing in their offerings of dedication. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is they're all going to offer the exact same gifts to God. Why might that be? It doesn't tell us, but I'm just curious if anybody has a thought on that. Why might it be that everybody, like when we do our collection on the first day of the week, we all are giving something different. We're giving what we prosper. But in this case, it seems as though God has made it clear they're each giving the exact same thing. Why might they all be giving the exact same thing?
So one can brag more than the other?
I think that's exactly right. I think it's the idea where the tribe of Judah, because remember when you counted the numbers of the Israelites, the tribes aren't equal in size. Now, you might just have this case where one tribe says, well, you know what, that tabernacle, we built it. I grew up in the congregation I grew up in. There was a woman that had put a lot of money into the church. Everybody's very grateful for that. But sometimes you would talk about, well, my church, I paid for it, and she was still a good woman. But it's still kind of a strange thing to think of. And it'd be very easy for some very worldly Israelites, and Israelites were never worldly, right? for them to start saying, well, hey, we paid for it. So it's kind of interesting that all the tribes are bringing in the same kinds of gifts. You read about them like in verse 13 when they talk about the offerings that they're doing, silver, gold, oil, grain, animals, and they're bringing all these things together. So it's really interesting.
I
Stephen?
think it's an amazing illustration of how much they took out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Here are slaves being able to go, I mean, you look at just today,
Yeah.
the value of the silver and the
Yeah.
gold and
Yeah.
everything they had, and they had enough to, anyway.
Stephen, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Cover lots of things with. And
Because you're exactly right. This was all taken out of Egypt. But how did these slaves end up with so much wealth when they left? Do you remember the story of how they ended up with so much wealth? Gregor, do you remember?
The Egyptians paid them to leave.
The Egyptians paid them to leave. Yeah, the Egyptians just loaded them up to get them out. So interestingly enough, when you say that, it really is striking. I went to a museum in Chicago once, and they were showing some Egyptian stuff, and it talked about the gold rings. And I always think of a gold ring like a ring, but they were about the size of a donut. You know, that everything is within terms of food for me. So it was about the size of a donut. A gold ring was actually not something you wore. It was a huge amount of wealth. So they loaded them up. And you're exactly right. That's where this wealth came from, that they offered all of these things up. So that's what chapter 7 is dealing with, all the things that are dedicated. You see a lot of names here. What's important for you? I always like to pay attention to names because we see a lot of times people come back later. And, kind of to me gives you this sense of, well, I know what's going to happen with this guy. I know where this guy's going to go. And so it's kind of interesting. That's where I like electronic tools that allow you to look at a name and then find where it occurs again in the Bible. You find some really neat things whenever you look at names like that. But Moses, of course, is doing all this, and they make all these sacrifices. Maybe the last thing that I think is really interesting is the very last verses here. In verse 89, it says, when Moses went into the tabernacle of meeting to speak with with God, he heard the voice of one speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the ark of the testimony, from between the two cherubim. Thus he spoke to him. Yeah, in the Holy of Holies. Which, by the way, is going to bring up a little question here, because in the book of Leviticus, who do you read is allowed to go to the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest. So it's kind of an interesting thing about Moses. We'll come back to that here in just a second, that Moses was actually back there as well. I always wonder about the Holy of Holies because, one of the things that the Hebrew writer reminds us of this. He says, nothing was dedicated without blood. What were they doing in this place? How are they consecrating it, by the way? Wow, sprinkling blood. You guys ever been to a slaughterhouse and the smell of a slaughter? I've often wondered if the temple and the tabernacle smelled terrible. I've wondered that many times, because it wasn't as though you could have somebody come in and clean afterwards. Especially if you have a room that, I read one historian or one ancient historian that thought maybe they had some really weird ways of cleaning back there. But my suspicion is it stank. It was just, because of what was going on there, it was a really rough place. Josie, I know you were going to make a comment or had a question.
No, I was just going to say, my husband used to work in a slaughterhouse.
And?
Yep, he'd come home stinky.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Look at all the sacrifices we just did. What must that have been like? And
He said that the drains would plug up and you'd be knee deep
oh, yeah.
in, because that coagulation.
Well,
was so fast.
and one thing I don't understand, in the New Testament during the Passover, everybody came to the temple. And the historians of the time, like Josephus, talk about hundreds of thousands of cattle being killed. Now, the amount of blood, I've heard stories of people saying, the amount of blood that would have been coming out would have been, when you talk about rivers of blood, we usually mean that metaphorically, but it would have been literally like a river of blood coming out in some of those places. And like I said, I just don't think we can appreciate how gruesome some of these moments were. When Solomon will dedicate the temple later, the number of sacrifices that go on there are just, you read a number and you just don't think about how many animals just died and what that would be like to have to deal with that many animals dead. So this was staggering.
Well, chapter 7 is 12 days.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
must be 6 or 7 different animals
Yeah, and this one isn't one of the biggest ones either. That's what's really, really incredible. So, a couple of questions for you out of chapter 7. Number one, one of the tribes, one of the groups, one of the families of the Levites was not given carts. What was the reason that is given to us about this one? Josie?
They were to carry it on his shoulder.
Yeah. Now, Josie, I'll put you on the spot. Why?
Because that was the holy things that had to be carried.
You know, it's kind of interesting. The holy things, and he'll go on to say, and you don't touch the holy things. So, you know, by the way, we think of like the Ark of the Covenant, but there were other things, and he says, you don't touch, he said, you don't touch any of them. Now, what's really interesting is they wouldn't give him carts with oxen. What's going to happen in David's time that we're reminded of with Uzzah?
Well, they teetered.
Yeah, they actually put the ark in a cart with oxen, and people died because of that. So it's kind of interesting that here, very specifically, Moses didn't even give him a cart. Said, you guys have got to carry these things. You have to carry these things. And so that's a really interesting comparison there. Second question, why is it that Moses, at the holy place, was something only the high priest could go? Aaron had, a few months before, been made the first high priest of Israel. The first high priest of Israel. Moses, by the way, Moses is not only not the high priest, Moses is not even a priest. So how does Moses go in there? What do we know? What would you say, Grant?
I say, in a sense, I think you'd say Moses has already been in the presence of God.
Yeah, where?
On the burning bush.
Yeah, and subsequent to that or after that?
Mount Sinai.
And then on Mount Sinai, Moses is the only one allowed to talk to God. And God kind of makes a point about that. And this is over, if we go a couple chapters over in Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. This was when the Israelites were kind of like, well, I don't, you know, actually it was Miriam and Aaron. This is kind of interesting. The high priest and the high priest's sister, and this is of course Moses' brother and sister, are complaining about Moses. And God comes down in the pillar of the cloud, which is the tabernacle appearance. He comes to the tabernacle and he reminds the Israelites, and this is verse, as I said, I'll start off in verse 6. Then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Now here's God saying something very important. What is Moses? He's not a high priest. He's a prophet. Now, what are the other prophets in Israel? And the answer is, well, there really aren't any. We'll have that moment where the spirit of Moses is taken out and passed among the people. But Moses is unique. In fact, the word prophet isn't even a familiar word. Later on in the book of 1 Samuel, you find out that they didn't even use the word prophet very often. They were very confused about what that word meant. And so you don't see a lot of prophets until the time of Samuel to get this reference to. But God says, hey, wait a second. Number one, this guy is a prophet. And I talk to prophets. And then he goes on to say, but he says, most prophets, I'll talk to them in a dream or a vision, but not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak to him. How does God insist on talking to Moses? Face to face. Face to face. Tasha.
Like a friend.
Like a friend. Nice. You know, it's interesting that Abraham's called a friend of God. But in Exodus chapter 33, it'll say God talks to Moses face to face like he would talk to a friend. So he says, I talk to him face to face, plainly, not in dark sayings. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then weren't you afraid to talk against my servant Moses? So here we have God himself saying, Moses gets a particular audience with God that nobody after Moses, with, you know, when I say a rare exception, nobody else after Moses. Now the Hebrew writer, by the way, again, this is one of those times where Numbers is kind of neat. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 3, he says, you know who the great guy of the Old Testament was? He says it was Moses. And he quotes this verse. He says Moses was faithful as a servant of God. But then he says, we got somebody better now, Jesus. And he says, whereas Moses was a servant, Jesus is a son. And so he says he speaks like a father and a son as opposed to a faithful servant. But it's kind of interesting that Moses, the Bible wants us to appreciate the idea that Moses gets to speak to God uniquely in a way that nobody else does because he is in this particular place. So the tabernacle is consecrated. Who are the people that are going to take care of the tabernacle? Levites. And by the way, just to remind you, all priests are Levites, not all Levites are priests, right? In fact, the vast majority of Levites are not priests. But the Levites as a group are charged with caring for the temple and the things of the temple. And so chapter 8 sets us up for this process of getting the worship, and I like to think of the worship like a system. It was a system of worship that they were supposed to be in charge of. And it begins with, in verses 2 and 3, this lighting of this lampstand. Josie mentioned lampstand earlier. And he goes on to talk about how the Levites are to, verse 6, he says, take Levites, cleanse them ceremonially. Verse 7, this is what you're going to do. Sprinkle water of purification on them. Let them shave all of their body. Let them wash their clothes. So make themselves clean. So make themselves clean. Then he says, and then you go on, you make this offering for them. And this consecrates the Levites. He goes on to verse 12. He says, and it makes atonement for the Levites, that they're going to be cleansed for them. Now he goes on in verse 16 to talk about how the Levites are entirely given to him from among the children of Israel. He says originally he had set aside to take the firstborn of every family, but now he has taken instead the Levites. And he says in verse 19, I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and his sons from among the children of Israel to do the work for the children of Israel in the tabernacle of meeting, and to make atonement for the children of Israel, that there be no plague among the children of Israel. So let me kind of ask you to think about this for a second. If you were born a Levite, like in the New Testament, who's this is kind of a tricky question. Here's a hard question for you. Who's the most famous Levite of the New Testament? I could say most famous because the Bible says he's actually the most famous man. But who's the most famous Levite in the New Testament? John the Baptist. Very good, Linda. Now, John the Baptist, his father was a priest, but of course John the Baptist was not a priest. So kind of interesting how that is. John the Baptist was a prophet, so he had a very different calling. But here's what's interesting to think about this. If you had been born a Levite, what kind of things would you do? What would your life be like, do you think?
Service.
You'd be a servant. How often would you be a servant? Well, every day, rest of your life? Okay. You did have a...
Until age 50.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. There is a retirement age. Number 2, what we find out later, and you read this in 1 Samuel chapter 1, is that, what does God... God doesn't give an inheritance to Levites, but what does he give them? Remember the 24 things, or 72 things he does give them? They don't get territory, but they get 72 cities. So here's the thing to think about. Wait a second. Those cities were all over the place that they received. So if you were a Levite, did you work at the tabernacle all your life? Because you had cities that were your home. Yeah, well, you could say retirement. What we find out is that they actually have something called courses. And you read about, for example, Elkanah was in his course at the time. It even talks about the priests having courses. And later you find that it's mentioned, we don't know if they created this or if this was actually implied in law Moses, there'd be 24 courses where you would go. So if there was once a period over a certain amount of time, every 24, you're probably going to think months, that'd be a good characteristic, probably something a little shorter than that. How often would you be at the temple then? Well, maybe once every 2 years. You spent a month working at the temple. And the rest of the time, well, you're probably at your home. You're probably in these other places. So it's interesting to think, if you were born a Levite, it doesn't mean, well, I'm going to be working at the tabernacle the rest of my life. What it means is once every year, once every 2 years, you would go and spend a certain amount of time at the tabernacle working, and then you'd go home. You'd go back to your field. You'd go back to your city.
Didn't they have farmland outside the city?
That's right. They had, and I don't remember exactly what the language of that farmland was, but it was the idea that the city and then a certain degree of land outside of the city belonged to them, and they were allowed to farm and to take care of those things. So interestingly enough, if you'd have been a Levite, you weren't always at the tabernacle. You spent probably more time away from it than at it.
What did they do for work there? Were they working with the sacrifices and
That
handling the bowls and everything?
is a super important question. Gerald, I'm going to tell you the truth. Other than what we just read, I'm not sure, Gerald. So what do you think it might have been? You gave some good ideas. What might that look like?
It looks like there's an awful lot of activity there.
Yeah.
To cut the meat up and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. So So that might mean, Gerald, for example, a lot of the work of a Levite could be animal control. So this is interesting. Like I said, we're kind of left to speculate about keeping the temple service running. What does the maintenance crew look like? What is, Heather's not here tonight, but what does Heather do for us all the time? Well, she vacuums the building. She prepares things. The Levites probably did a lot of things like that. Like I said, I said that Holy of Holies, I don't think they could access, but there might have been a lot of places where they could access, and I'll bet they were cleaning a lot of blood every day.
When you think about an altar, you think of a table or something. You
Yeah.
dump a bowl up onto a table, but that's sacrifice. It has to
Yeah.
be something maybe ground level to collect the control of the blood.
So-
to drain it.
So that's an interesting thing. One of the things we described the altar is it had a ramp up to it, that the Israelites had to walk up it to some degree, and it was enormous, right? It was,
But I think there was a lot of people having to control that bowl. From my experience, they don't do what you want them to do.
yeah, that's right, yeah.
Gotta keep
So,
under control while you're.
so what Gerald is saying, and it's probably true, Levites were cowboys. But that might be true. I mean, it might really be a thing to say that could have been a lot of what they were doing. Now, by the way, the altar, somebody ought to look this up and remember the exact dimension of it. We think of an altar, but the altar might have been closer to the size of these chairs, of the square area here, because it was enormous. It was huge. I've seen some nice pictures of that. If you remember, the altar was held up by four bulls, get my words out correctly, four oxen, golden oxen that sounded like they were the size of oxen. So you imagine something that was big enough that four oxen on each side held it up in four places. I mean, that's pretty dramatic, if I'm remembering this correctly. As I said, the altar, I think, would be about the dimension of the chairs here. It would have been that large.
As I said, I think one of the things we do get described telling us that the Levites who weren't the priests did is that they were security to keep people who weren't supposed to be there
Oh,
away from
interesting.
the
Great, I don't remember that at all, but
Yeah, well, we were talking about when Lamar was teaching that he tells the Levites that they weren't supposed to allow the people who weren't allowed.
I never thought about that. So that's very interesting, and we know the Levites were fighters, on a number of occasions. So that's a very interesting point to say they're temple security. Yeah.
And I think here when it's talking about the years that they minister, it talks about they keep guard.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting because you don't think about that, but that might be a large part of their job too. Again, cowboys, I think, but it really just might have been a large part of their job. So like I said, I think what's interesting is to think of Levites. We think of the holiness of the priest. They had to be wear these special garments, know these special rituals. The Levites, they're the gift to the priest, so to speak, that they might have done things that we'd have been a lot more familiar with if we worked with animals, if we worked security, if we worked building maintenance. These would be the kind of things that they would be responsible for. I think we'd be more familiar with.
I have a question. So, I'm assuming there's quite a few animals involved. Where were the animals kept? Because the tents were all around, so.
Yeah. Yeah, so do you remember how, and you're describing the idea that there was actually a specific formation of tents. Now, Teresa, I'll just tell you, first of all, I don't remember that if it says or not, but if you said, Brian, would you guess, I would guess that out beyond that is where you would have kept the animals to that degree. Now, there is a question about, like, the maintenance of animals. The people were supernaturally fed and cared for. I don't know how the animals were taken care of. There are conversations, by the way, during this time of buying food and buying things that, so it's not as though 100% of their food was manna, but because it does say that they bought and traded for other things as well. But what about the animals? How were they cared for? And there were so many animals that you say, well, there had to be some kind of system in place, but it might also have been supernatural that some of that was taken care of. I'd love to hear if somebody had a better answer than that, because Teresa, I'll just tell you frankly, I don't know the answer to that. That's a really Gregor's got the answer.
No, he doesn't.
No.
But the observation is we know that God did so many miraculous things from keeping their clothes from falling apart.
Yeah.
And it's just a number of
Yeah,
things
right.
People never talk about that, but all those
Right.
things would be necessary to have some 2 million people wandering the wilderness for
Right.
40 years.
Right. Gregor, I think a lot about your statement there that their shoes and their clothing never wore out for 40 years. By the way, a lot of archaeologists today will say, well, one of the reasons we're skeptical about this is that there's not a lot of archaeological remains in Sinai that 2 million people lived there for a period of time. Gregor just told you why there's not. because archaeologists, 100% of, well, 100%, but the great majority of what they're looking at is trash. And they weren't throwing a lot of things away because things weren't wearing out. And Gregor rightly points out that was a supernatural moment that the Bible specifically says God prevented that. And I have no problem, again, going back to Teresa's question, to say that may well have been some of the aspect with animals as well. I want to move to the next question here. The Levites were told to shave their bodies. What do you think about that? What might that symbolize? What do you think?
Well, that was to show that they didn't have any impurities anywhere.
Yeah, nice. So, it's kind of interesting to say that, sometimes impurities can be covered up by hair. So, unless you got a beautiful head like mine, you just don't know what some of these heads out here look like. Stephen and I, we've got good looking heads though. So, talk
Twin brothers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But the truth is that there is a great point there. What else was the issue with hair? Think of something in Leviticus chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. He says, we're going to shave off the hair, and by doing so, what do they become? He'll use the word clean. He'll say that by shaving all that off, you become clean. One other aspect you might consider is that the Nazirite vow, you also would shave your head, but you shaved it as a sacrifice to God. So several different things you might think of here. The language specifically says this was their method of consecration, was to remove all the hair from their body, and that this was their method of consecration and preparing themselves for God. Josie, I really like your answer, though. I think that's a really neat point. Teresa?
Is that a one-time thing, or did they have to?
Yeah, I think it was a one-time thing. Now, Teresa, I'm not saying that authoritatively, because I could be wrong, that I've just missed it somewhere else. But it's my understanding, not only was it a one-time thing, but it might have only been here that it ever happened. There's several things that only seem to happen here, because what we're doing in these chapters is we're lighting off worship for the first time. It's like, it's saying this is the first time it's going to start like this, and so a lot of what we're seeing here are things that aren't going to be repeated for a very long time. So very, very interesting point that's going to be moved forward. Numbers chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. Josie, you already kind of threw this to us, but what was the age that you start working at? What was the age that you retire at?
You started at 20 years and you ended at 50.
Okay, so seems good to get a retirement at 50 years old. What do we have to consider about that?
They probably didn't live as long.
Yeah, and by the way, we know for a fact these people won't live as long because everybody over 20 died by the time they were 60. We might consider that that was a
But
fact.
not at this time.
Yeah, not yet, but in the next
Yeah.
9 months, they're all going to be cursed,
Yeah.
and they're going to be told none of you are going to make it. So in 40 years, every person over 20 will die. In that 40-year period. So nobody's going to live to 60 or past 60. It's a heavy thing, right?
Verse 26 gives them another task, though. They're supposed to minister, which I take that they mean teach.
That's an interesting point that is seen several times where it's the idea of them teaching, Ryan. And that's kind of interesting because more than once it seems like later on that the prophets are angry with the Levites over this absence of teaching. Now, where you see a great sense of that, though, is in Grant's, you were going to say Nehemiah, weren't you? Oh, no. In Ezra and Nehemiah, where it talks about how the priests and the Levites went among the people, giving them a sense of the meaning of the law. And so that's kind of interesting. So, Ryan, it does seem like, in particular, the Levites, one of the things they did away from everyone was to educate people about the law. You see that in the New Testament a little more when it talks about Levites, and them, some of the things that they did. Grant, you have a comment?
I was just going to say that they stopped the temple service at 50, but we talked before about them all having their own cities that I'm sure a lot of them went back to
Right.
work there.
Right. Yeah. So I say retirement. Yeah, it's not really accurate. It just means that you were no longer traveling to the tabernacle for that service anymore. So kind of interesting. It doesn't mean you were done with work because you still were working. So that's a great point, Stephen.
There seems to be a little confusion because, at least here, mine reads that you had to be 25. And earlier in Numbers 4, it says you had to be 30. So part of the explanation for the 5-year difference that I've read is that that was sort of a preparation for actually working directly in the temple or working in 25 and 20, verse 24.
So there is a distinction. I didn't realize there was a distinction at age 20 and 25. There is a distinction about the age 30. And I've heard some people suggest that maybe what we're doing is we're actually talking about what a priest was called to do versus what a Levite was called to do, or specifically the type of Levite service is why there's a difference in some places. And we were going over to Numbers 8, 24, and 25, which, as I said, I didn't realize that would have two different readings of that passage. I missed that was the case. So that's interesting that it goes into that. I'm trying to grab that passage now real quick and look at it while we're talking. What did you have elsewhere about that, about the age?
Well, numbers 4 or something.
Yeah.
I don't remember really in Numbers it says it had to be 30.
Yeah.
And here it says 25. And again, some have speculated that the 5-year difference is just sort of an apprenticeship kind of thing where you're.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I've heard, like I said, that maybe it was a difference between the priest, who goes in at 30 as well, and some of that language. A lot of people like to point out who started his work at 30. Jesus did, whereas John the Baptist started much earlier. And so some people say John the Baptist was a Levite to Jesus' high priest, kind of a concept. Maybe. Or maybe, like I said, it's just, I think your explanation is also good to say perhaps there is a training period that they're going through there as well. Very good comment, Stephen. Very good comment. Anybody else have a comment? Bring up. So then chapter 9, as we move into chapter 9, they come to the first of the Passovers. Now, by the way, we're a little bit out of chronological order. Sometimes that gets a little confusing, but that's the way Moses wrote. Moses oftentimes would write something, and then he'd step back and tell the story a second time, a different way, so that he rewound himself several times. He does it in Genesis. It's one of the ways we can kind of recognize the way Moses writes is that he would sometimes rewind what he says and step back. And we're almost at a rewinding point where he starts off by saying, here is our first Passover. Now, what's different in this Passover than the last Passover? Maybe some obvious points. What's different?
They didn't have their clothes on.
Yeah, so being ready to leave was not very good, very good. So being ready to, number one, being ready to leave was not something that they brought with them to the Passover. We could call it the memorial of the Passover. Yeah, so interesting enough, and why not? Because what's not happening?
Because they're not going to have the death.
Yeah, the death, the destroyer is not actually passing over. So interesting enough, the first Passover, everything after this is now a memorial of that first Passover. So we kind of get a sense that does make it a little different. Kind of helpful because what are some of the differences between Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper and our observation of a memorial of the Lord's Supper? There's one big one. What day did Jesus do it on? Yeah, Thursday, but he gives us the first day of the week. Later in the New Testament, we see how that has changed there as well. So there's kind of some interesting point to say that the commemoration of the Lord's Supper does have a small change from the original institutional meal of the Lord's Supper, and so it was with the Passover. So we see a little bit of a variation there. We don't celebrate the Passover on Thursday. Acts 20 verse 7 talks about us celebrating it on the first day of the week. So we have this idea as well. So he goes through the rules of how it is that they're to observe this and how important it was that they were. I think the rules are interesting just as he goes through here. And as he continues on to talk about this, he also talks about the idea that if there's a question that comes up that if somebody should miss the Passover, this begins in verse 6. Some of the men had handled a dead body, and so which you think, well, that kind of thing happened. That makes them ceremonially unclean. So they say, what do we do? Verse 7, we were defiled. It's kind of like the way they ask it is almost a, why can't we come celebrate? So what was God's rule in verse 11 about the Passover if you could not, for lawful reasons, partake of it?
Wait a month.
Yeah. So the next month, same day, the next month.
Twilight.
Yeah. So kind of a makeup Passover. I don't know how else to describe that, but something that if you had been ceremonially defiled, you could wait a month. You could do it. Time of Hezekiah, by the way, they do something a little different. They actually push it a week instead of a month. Kind of an interesting thing they do there. But otherwise, God had said, well, if you can't be there, if something has come up with that, you wait a month. Grant?
You say it almost sounds very much like we describe attendance in the assembly,
All right.
because he talks about if you couldn't do it, it's okay, but if you were just
Yeah.
neglectful, it's not.
Sometimes we point out, and by the way, that's a very interesting point. Sometimes we point out that the significance of this is sometimes where we say, what's the big question we ask sometimes with regarding the Lord's Supper, that we kind of point to this as an answer. Can we have a second serving? You know, and so we say, well, there was a second process. We of course don't have a second assembly, so we don't have that opportunity. But I know most of us have come from congregations where our way of handling that was to offer a second offering. And sometimes we'll point to this and say, like the Passover, if somebody was unable, and Grant made a good point to say, unable versus, well, how did you put it? Neglectful, unwilling, whatever it might be, that if somebody was unable, that second opportunity was available. And sometimes we say, well, we can see perhaps a pattern that gives us a better understanding of that. It's a great observation. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a genuine authorizing point, but it does give us a sense of how we might handle a question like that. I realize now we're at our time. And I did not. Let me jump ahead. The real things I really wanted to talk about was the cloud and the fire. I really love talking about those things, and I'm really sorry I wasn't paying attention to time, and I let that get away from me.
It's okay, we all read it.
Yeah, I hope so, yeah. Let me just summarize with this. Let me go to the very end and make the point. What are the big things you want to walk away from here? Number one, consecration and purification are big deals here. That's the thing that strikes you the most about these first, actually all the way up through chapter 10, from chapter 1 to chapter 10. Consecration, purification are big deals. And that's something that the New Testament writers want us to think about. And one of the great points he makes in chapter 10 is he'll kind of reference that, and then he'll start talking about us being cleansed by a water of purification, by a sprinkling, by all these things, a sprinkling of blood and a water of purification. He's talking about baptism. Kind of as this sense of, it sprinkles your heart with the blood of Christ, and it purifies your body. This kind of what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:21. He talks about baptism. It's about the conscience as well as, submitting in the flesh. I love this language. And it really only makes sense, Hebrews 10 only makes sense if you have an understanding of this process of consecration that the Israelites went through. The second thing is, we didn't even get to touch this, but there are two kinds of sacrifices that are offered. Gifts, sacrifice for sin. And that those two things come to play in the New Testament because we still offer sacrifices, and yet we're told that Jesus is a sacrifice once and for all. Terry, go ahead and hit the alarm because they're probably chomping at the bit to get out, and I'll just wrap up after that. But let's just kind of finish up with this thought that we have one sacrifice for sin that was once and for all. But we are living sacrifices of gifts to God, whether it's the sacrifice of the fruit of our lips, of our daily sacrifice, whatever it might be. So that's what we need to appreciate that the book of Numbers is leading us into, is a concept of two types of sacrifices, so that we can say Jesus is once for all for sin, but our daily living sacrifices are gifts to God. And so it's important, like I said, the book of Numbers gives us that. Thanks so much. Wow, great comments tonight, and I really appreciate it. Sorry we went over a little.
Remove myself for no reason.
If you would go ahead and mark your song books, it's song number 311. Song number 311. This will be our song of invitation following our message this evening, song number 311.